Hey there, y'all, and welcome to our next Zeitgeist video. Today, we are going to be exploring medieval England. And even what that means is kind of a topic for debate. Like, when do I mean when I say medieval England? Some people would say that that goes from about 430 CE to 1485. This includes the period all the way from when the Romans left Britain to when Henry VII, the first Tudor king, takes the throne. That works for me, so we'll go with that. But we obviously already talked some about early medieval England in our last video. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the later parts of that period in what we talk about for today. So the England that we know started out as this mix of really diverse peoples, right? So we had native Britons, if there even were such a thing. They were Celts, and then the Romans came in 43 CE, and they abandoned England by about 410. Then the Germanic tribes came, and we already talked about that in the last video, and that's why we call it England, right? Because they were the Anglecuin, and they called their land Angleland eventually, right? Then we had Vikings who came in the 8th century, and then we had the Normans who showed up in 1066. And this is sort of the period that I want to talk about here. We're going to look right here at this little tapestry right in this corner. All right, there we go. Image from the bio tapestry there that talks about the invading army of the French who showed up in 1066. And that is when most people, I think, would say that what we truly call medieval England begins. So that's what we're going to talk about. And I want us to think about the context for most of the work that we'll be looking at in this section of our class is focused on the literature of the 14th and 15th centuries. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is context for that much later time period, the very end of what we think of as medieval England. So at this point, by the time we get to the 14th century, all of these different diverse peoples and societies kind of came together. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were like a unified society, but they were certainly one country, one nation. And certainly at this point, everybody is speaking English, even if it sounds a little bit different from ours, but they still use French and Latin for official languages for government and law and education and things like that. And in fact, and I've probably already mentioned this in class, if you were not able to read and write in Latin, you weren't even really thought to be literate or educated. So that literacy campaign of King Alfred is certainly in our past at this point. And reading and writing in Latin is the thing that most people hold as the standard for being a literate or educated person. So by the late 1300s, England is able to hold its own against all the cultures in continental Europe in terms of cultural development. They have two major universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and they are amongst the finest, and certainly in Europe, if not around the world, but I'm not going to make that kind of a claim here. The arts are flourishing. English poetry, not just Latin, is starting to take on its own shape and size and dimension and be something really worthy of thinking about. And so reading and writing in the vernacular is just really starting to gain some traction against that idea that you have to read and write in Latin for it to be something. So we have authors like John Gower and William Langland and Thomas Hoccleve, John Lydgate, and of course Geoffrey Chaucer, who's this guy down here in the corner of our video, leading the way on this charge of making the English language a really literate language and a language of poetry and more than just basic daily communication, right? So we've seen this image before and we've already talked about it, but I want us to come back to it now, that medieval England is a society that thinks about the way it organizes itself, not in terms of class, like how much money you have, but instead by the way that each person functions and contributes to the community. So this is our image of the three estates, and we've certainly already talked about this, but it's important to remember that everyone, including the king, has responsibilities to the community. Unless everyone does their part, the community is going to weaken, it's going to crumble. And so we have this image of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, and that each person has to do their share if we want the community to flourish and be working at its best. We're also starting to see at this time period what we tend to think of as the fourth estate coming into play as well. That's not the press. You may have heard people refer to the press as the fourth estate, but it's actually this idea of merchants, people who live and work in cities. we have this whole class of people, this whole group of people in England who are growing rich through work and trade. And English merchants are really well known across Europe for the quality of their wool, for their corn, and we have all kinds of luxury items coming in as a result of that trade. Spices and silks and all of these different things from the Arabic world and beyond even. So moving to towns and cities is really becoming a thing that a lot of people want to do. They're crowded, they're dirty, the sanitation may not be the best, but it is still a place of opportunity. It's a place that, unlike on a farm, you don't have to work outside in any weather, regardless of what's going on. You got to get out there and feed the cows. In a city, you work on a more normal schedule and you have some opportunities to better yourself. And this is something that a lot of people were really looking at. But we still have peasants who are forming the largest share of the population. They farm small tracts of land, and many of them still depend on landowners for wages, and many of them are just barely scraping by. And so this is really significant when we get to what is possibly the most significant and scariest event of this whole period, which I'm sure you've heard of, the Black Death. Sometimes it's called the plague, right? So in 1350, the Black Death eliminated maybe a third, possibly as many as a half, as much as a half of the population in England. The plague came back multiple times. It came back in 1360 and 1369 and 1375. And by the mid 15th century, the population of the whole country of England was only about 2.5 million people. So many people had died of the plague. And it wouldn't be until like the 17th century that the population levels of the country returned to where they were in 1300, before the waves of plague started coming through. This is a hard thing, I think, for us to talk about and think about in our COVID functioning society right now. But one of the things that's interesting to know, I think, about the plague is that the people who survived, the people who got through it, they probably lived better lives than they would have done had the plague never come through, right? This big sweeping disease eliminated a lot of laborers. It led to raising prices, higher wages, better working conditions. The standard of living actually did go up for people who survived the plague and got to the other side of it. And that's something certainly I think we are just starting to maybe see the first inklings of in our own society now, when we think about all the waves of people who are saying, like, I'm not going to work this crappy job for these crappy wages anymore. I need and want something better out of my life. And so hopefully we will see something similar happen in our own society. It doesn't compensate for all the lives that we've lost and all the tragedies, but it is an interesting fact of history that hopefully we can see some kind of glimmer of hope at the end of it. Hopefully that doesn't sound too callous, but just one of those things that medievalists think about right now. So these improving working conditions for peasants, though, were really an issue for the big landowners, kind of like really wealthy CEOs now who don't want to pay their workers anymore. And so the farming that large-scale landowners did became less profitable. There were fewer goods to trade. They made less money. They increased taxes, right? And there's all these conflicts that are going on. And this led to something called the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. This had a lot of wide-reaching short-term improvements, but unfortunately, we can't say that, like, oh yes, there was a massive workers' rebellion and everybody got exactly what they wanted. But it is one of those moments in history that we can look back to and say, hey, when a lot of people come together, a lot of workers come together and mobilize for change, we do see some positive things that can happen as a result. And we just have to keep fighting for it instead of just trusting that whatever short-term goals have been achieved are good enough. So let's stop talking about peasants and go over here and let's talk about the king a little bit. We have over here on the side of our screen an image of Richard II. The history of the crown and the throne in this period is really tumultuous. This is Richard II. He was deposed by his nobles in 1399 because he wasn't really a great king. He spent a lot of money. He made all of his best buddies, like, really rich, and he didn't do a lot of the things that they thought a king should do. So this was the beginning of the infamous Wars of the Roses, which you may have heard of, that lasted up until 1485 when Richard III died. So at this point, very quick history of some of the kings. So Henry IV deposes Richard II in 1399. Richard II probably murdered. Henry IV's grandson, Henry VI, was deposed by Edward IV in 1461. Edward IV is then deposed by Henry VI supporters in 1470. Edward IV regains the throne in 1471, and Henry VI at this point is probably murdered. He was kind of a poor, sad, somewhat mentally unstable guy who had been king since he was a tiny child and never had a good life. But anyway, he probably shouldn't have been king in the first place. At this point, Edward IV is on the throne. The House of York is back in power. Edward IV dies young. He leaves his son, Edward V, who is only 13, in charge, and that never goes well. And his Edward V's uncle, Richard III, takes over the throne in 1483, and the boy and his little brother disappear, and some people say they were murdered, and some people say they weren't murdered until later, and some people say we just don't know what happened, but it's a whole mess. And then Henry VII, our first Tudor king, comes to the throne in 1485 after defeating Richard III in battle. His claim to the throne is tenuous at best. He's like an illegitimate great-grandson of somebody who had a claim to the throne way back in the day. So it's a real mess at the top of society at this point. But luckily, there is one big stabilizing force in society that is not the king, and that is the church. Absolutely, by far, the biggest influence in this period, not just in England, but throughout Europe, is the church. There is absolutely no separation of church and state at this time and place. Bishops and priests are statesmen. They hold high offices in the secular government. Most of the highly educated people in England are people who are affiliated with the church. And the church offers many career paths. It's not just like, oh, you go and you be a priest at a parish church, right? There's all these different kinds of roles that people can fulfill when they work for the church. The church had its own courts. They were the second largest landowner in England after the king, and they were completely exempt from taxes. So at this point, the church certainly fulfills a spiritual purpose, but it is also a thriving and somewhat corrupt business as well at this point. And so that leads to a lot of other problems that we'll talk about probably in our next video. So we'll save that. But no matter what's going on at the top with the church, this is a time that personal devotion and faith is high. We have an increasingly literate population who are able to connect with their faith through writing, not just through hearing sermons and hearing stories and watching plays in the street and things like that. But it is important to remember that religious habits, just like now, varied widely from person to person. Even if everyone is sort of at least nominally a member of the church and expected to hold to this sort of more or less standard kind of like code of behavior in terms of morals and ethics and so on, you know, it isn't like everybody was like absolutely super religious and absolutely believed everything that the church preached, right? It's the same as now. Some people went to church because it was social hour. Some people went to church because their parents told them they had to, or their neighbors would look at them funny if they didn't go, right? It wasn't necessarily that everybody had a deeply consistent faith. But it's important to note that even a lot of people who were skeptical of the church and its teachings often maintained like a very strong personal devotion. And there's a huge movement to reform the church in the 14th century. This is before Henry VIII peels England off from the Catholic Church. Again, we'll talk about that in the next video. But there is this group of men and women in England known as Wycliffites or Lollards. They are men and women who believe in a sort of personal, they do believe in a personal and direct relationship with God that is not mediated by church or priests. And they really believe in the importance of teaching and connecting to their fellow believers rather than in thinking about their faith in a sacramental sort of way. Like you don't have to go and take communion, you don't need to go to a church and experience things in this way. And so many people think of this as a kind of proto-Protestantism, a way of like looking ahead to some of the changes that come in spirituality and faith in about 100 years or so after this. So that's my little overview again of the zeitgeist of medieval England. I hope this was informative, and I look forward to talking with you about the different literature that grows out of this period in class next week. Thanks, bye.